Well, here we are, after way longer than it probably should have been. I eventually managed to get this out because goodness, there were so many films that came out in February. I just could not squeeze them all into one video. This is unfortunately going to be in two parts just to give me something I can put out and to make the editing vaguely manageable. Also a bit of a change of scenery because why not? And in this episode we're going to be talking about 9 films, all of which either came out at the very start of February or the very end of January. So let's get started talking about Uncut Gems. Okay, answer me this honestly. Outside of a very small group of people who actually saw this coming, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are ahead of the curve in comparison to me, but wow, I seriously did not expect this coming from Adam Sandler as the lead star. And I say this with the knowledge that Uncut Gems will definitely not be everyone's cup of tea. After all, it's the kind of challenging film that caught me off guard in an amazing way. But after giving a lot of time to the movie, I can confirm that it's even more than that. It is seriously something special. And while of course it would be easy to just point to Adam Sandler's performance and say, well, that's an easy reason why, there's so much more going on just beyond that. For example, the film feels remarkably raw, evidenced through how everyone is consistently talking over each other, especially in that opening scene. Really builds a great atmosphere, with that ambient sound making the film feel more spontaneous and also more natural. This is probably the most important element of the film because it gives it that seamless foundation to work off of. It also creates an atmosphere of pure chaos, which is certainly, if you've watched the film, you'll know it's certainly thematically relevant. And that's because Uncut Gems is a frighteningly bleak delve into the mind of a man on the edge of insanity. His name's Howard Ratner, and money pretty much acts as his only form of escapism. Well, that and his work colleague slash girlfriend Julia, with whom he shares an apartment. He finds himself being hunted on all sides by various people who he owes money to. So much so that you might not feel that sympathetic for him when you realise that he's using said money to bet on basketball games. But that's the trick, and that, for me, is what makes Uncut Gems so damn good. Now, I've always understood writing as such, this idea that a good writer, yes, they might make you feel sympathetic for a character, but what a great writer will do is make you feel that same sympathy without it really being all that warranted about a character who you might not even like, but you feel sympathetic all the same. Because while Howard is definitely not a compassionate or considerate person, it's not like anyone apart from Julia is kind and considerate to him throughout the runtime of the film. But despite all of that and all of those ideas that are planted in our head about Howard, how we might not want to sympathize with him, the final 20 minutes seriously push that, because you can't tell me for a second that during those 20 minutes where those events play out, you weren't rooting for him to some extent at least. However much the audience might want to criticize Howard for being as irresponsible as he is throughout the film, as those final moments play out, the perfect cross-cutting between Howard and Julia to intensify that elation, the same audience members who were once critical of Howard's actions earlier in the movie are not only rooting for him now, but sympathetic when he meets his tragic end. And it's not just tragic because Howard dies. The tragedy comes through more in the dramatic irony. I talked about the cross-cutting between Julia and Howard a little bit earlier, but that really intensifies the sense of dramatic irony because Julia doesn't know that Howard is dead. But the audience doesn't get that release of Julia actually realizing it and coming to terms with it, so the film leaves you on a really tragic note. Not just for Howard, for obvious reasons, but the irony highlights the tragedy for Julia. She's just left hanging. Only she's about $1 million richer than she was when they met for the last time. And you know what? That's probably the real tragedy here, especially seeing as she seemed to be the only person in the world who really did love Howard. I do have maybe one point of criticism with this film, that being those wide, big, sweeping shots at the start and end of the film. They just don't seem to serve as much of a thematic purpose as you might hope, and just end up kind of disorientating. And it is worth saying that without a doubt, this movie is one hell of a slow burn. But those final 20 to 30 minutes are probably one of my favorite 20 to 30 minutes of movie that I've ever seen. Certainly that I've watched this year so far. In other words, damn near a masterpiece. Without a doubt, go watch Uncut Gems. Fire up Netflix whenever you can and watch it, because however much it might not grip you from the very start, just hold out. I promise you, just hold out. It'll be worth it. And this is a 9 out of 10, damn near a masterpiece. And even though I have seen a lot of great films, a lot of other great films, including the one that I've just mentioned that were released in this period, unfortunately we're going to have to tackle one of the most mediocre films of the year in order to get there, that being The Rhythm Section. Now I'll breeze through this one quickly because honestly I just, again, thought it was completely and thoroughly mediocre, pretty disposable. And it probably shouldn't have been, because if I'm being brutally honest with myself, I think the concept is actually pretty neat. And if the film was more willing to explore the psychological trauma of what it meant for our protagonist to lose her parents in that way, I'm sure it could have worked better. Unfortunately, we don't get more of that kind of psychological implication. Like, there is a scene where Stephanie is on a plane going between locations, and so you'd think that there might be an opportunity for the directors to shove in some more of that kind of psychological subtext, what it means personally for her, given that she's now in that situation herself, but unfortunately there's none of that. It's really disappointing. And honestly, my comment that I've just made pretty much sums up my opinions on this film as a whole. I remember watching the trailer. I didn't know what it was playing before, but I remember seeing the trailer at some point, a few times maybe, and thinking, wow, this actually does genuinely look epic. And while the few action sequences that we do get certainly don't disappoint, I'm certainly underwhelmed as a whole. I mean, the narrative at least did go down pretty easy, mainly because there just wasn't that much to it. And in particular, that car chase sequence is actually really insane. I kind of love that. Actually had some real intensity to it. What I probably like most is Stephanie's character and her development and maturity throughout the film. And this idea that she's initially rejecting the fact that that crash was the result of a terrorist attack before she goes to make that decision to become an assassin. Unfortunately, a decision that this film makes look way easier than it probably was. But at the end of the day, to be perfectly honest with you, there's just nothing to this movie, hardly anything worth getting angry about. Yeah, again, it's got some decent moments, it's got the decent character, but that's pretty much your lot with this one. Certainly not anything worth getting angry about, but not anything anyone's going to remember by the end of the year. And judging by those box office numbers, doesn't seem like anyone else is going to remember it either. This is just a light 5 out of 10. But don't fret, because we're back to the good stuff, and we're going to be talking about The Lighthouse, which is a movie that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. And outside of making me, well, afraid of seagulls forever, I'm pretty sure, this film has a lot to offer, only if you're willing to give it that chance. And even though I'm going to try and give the film as thorough a deconstruction as I can, I know I'm going to miss some bits. The film is just too dense. I don't think any amount of deconstruction is going to entirely do this justice, so just bear with me on that. I'll try my best, but I'm sure I'll miss something. And I'll start off by saying one thing that I don't think can be denied by anyone. This movie is a masterpiece. And it's a masterpiece pretty much from top to bottom. There were just so many moments when watching it for the first time I was just like, wow, did that seriously just happen? We'll get into the technical details of why I think this film works on pretty much all fronts. But this film works pretty much on presentation alone. The constrictive 1.19:1 aspect ratio, which makes even the wide shots feel incredibly claustrophobic, the few that you get in this film. And the use of black and white helps create a hopeless, dreary atmosphere like I've never seen before. But as for the film itself, it's doing one critical thing right. And I've never really seen a film do this before. I'm sure there's been a lot of films that I've just not seen, but while I wouldn't consider this a typical kind of horror film, it's definitely not scary in that kind of conventional horror context. It's the kind of psychological horror that's subtle, but is also preying on the psychological weaknesses of its own audience through the use of an unreliable narrator. Because at the end of the day, we as the audience, however much we're seeing the film through the eyes of Winslow, we kind of have no idea who we can trust or whether this is all happening, because at the end of the day, Wake does say maybe this is all just a figment of your imagination. Like, how do we know that what he's saying is not true? We can't, and that's where the ambiguity comes in. But it's ambiguity that actually feels like it has a point and doesn't spend its time meandering. And during that same monologue, Wake even admits that he has no idea how long they've even been on the lighthouse, furthering this idea that this might just be all in their minds and their sense of time is being messed with. Again, it raises this question of, can we trust anyone's judgment? The Lighthouse nails a lot of things, but it really has a solid grasp on that idea of the unreliable narrator. And it raises a somewhat uncomfortable question about the film as a whole, and how much of it actually happens? Because you have the scene where Winslow is doing his painting of the lighthouse, and he's being lowered down by Wake, and then he falls. And he's just fallen. And I understand that there's supposed to be some like aligning imagery there that I totally get with how he ends up at the end, but he's just fallen off the side of the lighthouse. And what comes of it? What consequences are there to that? Nothing. So what's the deal here? Where is the line between what is reality and what is actually not happening at all? That's the real interesting thing for me. It's almost as if the film is making a conscious decision to frame the audience as being just as insane as those two people on the lighthouse for thinking that any of this could even possibly be happening. And it's just so weird and fascinating because, again, I've never seen a film do that before. And what might be even more stunning is the way that the characters interact with one another and how that contrasts with what the audience actually sees. In one particular scene near the end of the movie, Wake destroys a boat, a small boat that Winslow was going to escape on. But a few minutes later, Wake is insisting to Winslow, and by extension the audience, because Winslow's the perspective that we're seeing this whole series of events unfold through, that it was in fact him that destroyed the boat, as he was chasing him. And on top of that, the writing is constantly riding the line between being poetic and plain spoken. And it kind of does this at the same time in different points of the movie. And if I were to nitpick, then yeah, sure, there's very jarring shifts in tone. They're kind of the only thing here that's going to pull you out of the movie. But it still winds up more cohesive than it probably should have done. A dirge, but a remarkably intoxicating one. But I've put this off for long enough. The cinematography in this film, it's some of the best I've ever seen, full stop. And it's not just because the film is shot so damn well on a technical level, which of course it is, with a tremendous variety of shot types that demand the audience's attention, with the vast shots emphasizing the height of the lighthouse itself, almost going so far as to personify it. And yes, that's incredible, but what I found more interesting is how the film kind of subverts the use of traditional shot types. How it transcends typical convention. For example, the film relies a lot on very intense low-angle shots, especially in a lot of the scenes that are set outside. And while those shots, they're conventionally used to make the subject appear intimidating or powerful, they're being used here not to communicate that at all, but instead to suggest that something is lurking in the shadows just beneath them. It has a really uncomfortable and unsettling effect when you consider that subversion that the film's kind of trying to do. It creates more of a sense of unease than a sense that we should be intimidated by these characters. But that's barely even scratching the surface of why this film works so damn well technically. And in order to get further into that, we have to consider the use of sound. Because honestly, for me, I love the cinematography, but the sound is what puts it over the top. Particularly how the film relies on ambient sound. The crushing waves, the huge clunks of the machinery, the blistering wind. These all create an atmosphere that cannot be denied. And on the topic of this, the non-diegetic score is also amazing. Not afraid to get oddly dissonant at weird points when it demands it. Not even the diegetic sound escapes this treatment, with Winslow's screams smothered in ugly distortion to intensify his terror. And that's the thing, because what Winslow actually sees atop that lighthouse when he finally makes his way to the light, it remains in eerie subtext, let's just say that. And honestly, I kind of think the film missed a trick there. Ambiguity, yeah, it certainly works, especially if you're a Robert Eggers or an Ari Aster, but only up to a point. You have to present the audience with something at the end of the day. And even though the ending was incredibly intense, I was just waiting for that moment where it cut to an over-the-shoulder shot or point-of-view shot or something like that that gave us some kind of hint and glimmer into what Winslow is seeing that's triggering this incredibly emotional response from him. Unfortunately, that just didn't really materialize. Bit of a nitpick, but I was just waiting for that moment and it didn't come. And that might as well be my only criticism, because The Lighthouse is a remarkable film. Even if the Academy doesn't recognize how much of a masterpiece this is, make sure you go and support this film. It's certainly not a comfortable watch, but it's all the more essential all the same. And this is a 9 out of 10. And I wish I could say that the quality stays on this level, but unfortunately it doesn't. And we're moving on to a film that left me seriously conflicted when leaving the movie theatre, and that is Queen and Slim. Because on the one hand, yes, I do tend to gravitate towards films They're a little bit more raw in what they're exploring, and yeah, this certainly does fit the bill in that sense. And films that have a little bit more going on in the subtext. And Queen and Slim does seem to tick both of those boxes on the surface. It's a film that almost seems like it's trying to take a step back from the issues that it's trying to explore, and ends up feeling kinda half-formed as a result. Not as willing to dive headfirst into the issues that it's trying to confront with some nuance than I would prefer. Of course, when the film hits its early climax and the audience left with that eerie but very powerful bird's eye view wide shot of the crime scene, that's incredibly powerful, make no mistake, but the film seems to be trying with all of its might to undercut that drama, not helped by how the film carelessly diverts from its initial path. Sure, it might start off pretty dramatic, but by the midpoint the film was basically devolved into a relationship story rather than anything that's politically grounded. This is evidenced by how little you see the police in this film. The film is clearly trying to create the sense that you are on the run with these characters, so I guess it kind of makes sense not to show them all that much, as the characters are completely isolated from the police's plot to hunt them down. But the film seems to show the pair of them leaving chaos in their wake, almost as if it's setting up a kind of scavenger hunt for the police to then follow and find them, which of course never materializes. Because you had the whole thing of the sheriff being locked in the boot of a car, and it's like you'd think that would come important later, but again, doesn't, not even mentioned later on in the movie as far as I can recall. And all of that makes the fact that the police just kind of rock up at the end of the movie when they're needed to be there, it's just feels very plastic and constructed. Not exactly what you'd want from a movie like this. Just doesn't feel as dramatic as it should, that ending. And that feeling of relentless drama that the film desperately wants but has no idea how to cultivate and maintain, that comes through most in how compromised the editing can feel at one or two points in the movie. In one particular scene, cross-cutting is used in order to show the two events happening at the same time. One of those events was a child that Queen and Slim knew shooting a police officer in a protest of which that was linked to the idea that these two characters, they should be admired. And our second event is our aforementioned protagonist having sex in a car in the middle of nowhere. I get that the film is trying to communicate that these two characters are completely oblivious to the consequences of their actions because of how they're on the run. Well, the film makes an overall frail attempt to foreground their growing relationship, and it completely runs in the face of the actual drama of that moment, so it ended up pulling me out of the movie quite a bit. Again, especially when the police are just going to inexplicably turn up at the end, so the movie can hit its final emotional note. Just feels very calculated. But honestly, I'm more annoyed with myself that I didn't enjoy this movie more. And even though I do like it, and certainly the directing and cinematography are on point, and the film certainly isn't interested in meandering its way through easy answers, and I can certainly accept that, it does fall short for me, unfortunately, on a narrative and technical level. Unfortunately, this is just a 6 out of 10. Yeah, it's pretty good. It's not anything more than that. Certainly didn't work for me as much as I'd hoped. Now, moving on to A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, a film that, again, I'm just going to breeze through pretty quickly. Even though I do really like this film, I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would. Tom Hanks is certainly really well cast, and the critical acclaim that he's received for his role is certainly deserved. And the presentation is certainly really cute with how it cuts between the real world and then between scenes that like children's playset aesthetic. That was really cool. I like that a lot. And the film basically just defines the term crowd pleaser with its very nice, very comfortable message. It's certainly held back from greatness, and there are a few reasons for this. One of them is the kind of character of the journalist being framed as the cynical one. Like, feels a little played out, a little generic there, kind of painfully so. But the main problem that I have with this film is that from a narrative perspective, there were some serious missed opportunities here that were kind of hinted at the start but never probably followed through. The film sets itself up as if it's going to be entirely framed and entirely told within one of those, like, kids shows that the film clearly worships. But about halfway through and after one particular scene that you'll certainly know when you see it, the film kind of abandons that narrative device, and it's really disappointing when it does. It certainly grabbed me more than I thought it would do, but it's certainly not great. And maybe that has to do with the fact that I don't have the same nostalgic connection to the character in particular that Tom Hanks is playing. But this is certainly worth a watch, even if you don't have that nostalgic connection. This is definitely a 7 out of 10. Moving on to Richard Jewell, and wow, Clint Eastwood delivers one hell of a gut punch with his latest film. It's about a man accused of planting a bomb although he's the one who ends up discovering said bomb and hence saves a lot of lives, but is still put on the chopping block as a suspect. For me, what really works about this film is the way that it represents someone with learning disabilities, Richard Jewell himself, with Paul Walter Hauser in that title role. Throughout the film, Jewell wants to do whatever he can to comply with the law. Allow people into his mother's home, allow them to take things. He even shows certain knowledge about why they take the things they did. But despite his initial compliance and acceptance about the whole situation, and the fact that those above him see him as someone who can be easily manipulated thanks to his learning disabilities, but in the crucial moment at the climax of the film, he is the one who ends up interrogating and criticizing those who would dare criticize him for simply doing his job. The representation makes that final moment even more cutting, and the media certainly doesn't escape the crossfire here either, with Olivia Wilde playing the role of a journalist who claims to just be reporting the facts, when really she's all too aware of her place in the unforgiving media machine that's not really concerned with facts at all. And if I were to criticize, I can't quite tell whether it's a case of Olivia Wilde overacting a little bit, or the fact that her character is written in such a broad way, with the media generally being incredibly dramatized, probably even more than necessary. I can't quite put my finger on it exactly, but certainly the over-theatrical and dramatized representation of the media can get a bit distracting. What wasn't distracting in the slightest is the way the film uses a lot of recurring imagery in order to enforce its themes, particularly in highlighting the relentlessness of the media. During the scene in which the initial story is conceived, the natural lighting pierces through the blinds, ominously flooding over Kathy. The same imagery comes up again and again, with so many shots of Bobby looking through the blinds of her own home, some shots from her perspective and some shots from the media's, and this reoccurring imagery effectively acts as the connective tissue for the film. Another thing I love about this film is the way it ends. Yes, Richard Jewell is cleared of all blame for the attack, but it's less a feeling of triumph that he feels than it is just desperate relief, and despite the relief he might be feeling, it all comes with the acknowledgement that those events, they will colour both his and his mother's life forever. What a tragedy. Yeah, this is an 8 out of 10, definitely go see it. Okay, moving on, and I'm sorry to tell all of you this, because you're probably going to feel very upset and sorry for me, but for some reason I decided to see Dolittle, and I'll certainly say this. However much we've certainly had a few real duds in our exploration of what 2020 has to offer in film so far, I don't think any of them have seriously come close to Dolittle so far. In fact, I've not seen anything as soul-crushing as Dolittle in a very long time. But I guess I'll talk about it now. I suppose it's a film I saw, I guess. Better just rip the band-aid off now. But if I'm being honest, I was kind of looking forward to this film. Like, I kind of did want to see it. There was a part of me that was kind of interested, given how low the review scores were that it came out. In fact, I think when it originally came out, I'm not sure whether it's the case now, but it had a lower Metacritic score than Cats. How is that even possible? And if I'm being completely honest, those critics might be onto something, because Dolittle might just be one of the most remarkable failures I've ever had the misfortune of seeing play out on a movie theatre screen. If you want to see Robert Downey Jr. thoroughly embarrass himself for 90 minutes, coasting through a mindless narrative that's so lacking in diva subtext that you'd think a machine wrote it, then yeah, right, fine, Dolittle might just work for you. And what's baffling is that the first real problem with Dolittle comes through when you look at the film on a purely conceptual level. Because Dolittle is a film about an animal doctor who's looking after animals, and he works for the animals, and he's like locked himself in this whole forest landscape surrounded by his animals and all that. But the film revolves around the health of a human, that being the Queen. Bizarrely, not an animal. Pair that with Dolittle's selfish motivations, cringeworthy lowest common denominator humour, and some seriously misguided pacing, then yeah, you have a narrative that's simply detestable whichever way you look at it. And on the topic of Dolittle and his selfish motivations, to what extent does the film expect me to sympathise with this incompetent brat? Because after all, it is that incompetence that leads to the whole problem in the first place. Because apparently he had monkeys proofread his contract, and also apparently that's supposed to be funny, I don't know. And again, there are so many moments in the film that feel like they're supposed to be funny, but just aren't. Instead of inspiring laughter, they more just inspire deep regret that I'm spending my time watching Dolittle when I could be doing any number of other things. At the very least, I certainly laughed a little bit, mostly out of sympathy for the actors who are playing these roles, and the fact that they're having to tolerate such a bad script. I kinda do feel most sorry for a coasting Robert Downey Jr., considering Doolittle is written with absolutely no personality beyond the obvious. He can talk to animals, okay, great. At least you can tell that the writers were trying to give some kind of unique personality to the CGI animals, considering how their relationships kind of develop throughout. Certainly not enough to make the lumbering, janky CGI annoyances that the film dares call characters close to likable. But I appreciate how there's some kind of development throughout the adventure. Although any idea that the film had effort put into it becomes all the more compromised the deeper you look into the film. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the climax of the film, where Doolittle rushes to help a dragon and all the drama that could have potentially come through is thrown in the bin as the film defaults to such mindless, flatulent humour that you wonder if the screenwriters understand what drama even is. Or maturity, for that matter. I understand this is a kids' film, but oh my goodness, the best kids' films at least have some kind of sense of stakes and a mature breakthrough at the end of all of it. And this catastrophe somehow ends up with neither. But to wrap this up, look, just going through some of the worst films of last year, at least Wild Rose was competently written and structured despite completely misunderstanding the industry that it for some reason wanted to focus its story on. At least Black Christmas had some good acting, and there was some kind of vague attempt to stitch in some greater kind of subtextual narrative, even if it didn't materialize whatsoever and was incredibly offensive to anyone who even knows what feminism is. Even Cats had Ian McKellen and Judi Dench mostly escape with their dignities. Whereas Doolittle is so thoroughly atrocious, so devoid of any kind of decent writing, and above all, a huge waste of time. It looks horrible, the narrative feels completely mindless and plastic, and worst of all, Robert Downey Jr. has to carry this film on his CV to his grave. And to be honest, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. In other words, 2 out of 10. Worst film of the year so far by a country mile. Now onto a review that took me a long time to write. There's a lot of reasons for that, not least of which is the fact that the film is so densely packed with creativity and nuance that can be a challenge to both understand and contextualize given how separate I am from the culture that this film revels in. And of course I'm talking about the Bong Joon-ho directed film Parasite. But the wonder of this film comes in how everything that I've just said can easily be read as horrifically untrue. Because despite the differences in culture between the director and a Western audience, the message at the core of Parasite is not only without comparison, it's also universal. Frighteningly so, in fact. And it makes it easily the most rewarding film I've seen all year on repeated viewing. And however much you could easily water down the narrative to just being simply about how rich people are dumb and just leave it at that, that would be doing a significant disservice to this incredible screenplay. It's one of those films where initially you might not be 100% certain where the story is taking you, but once you do understand, once you realize it, you're all along for the ride. It will grab you by the throat and not let you go. The story starts off as a comedy, with a poor family seemingly effortlessly infiltrating, or you could say parasitically infecting, the rich family. But once you get to the end, you realize the story is in fact one of tragedy. A family meeting their cruel end at the hands of conflicting emotions, and societal divides that just weren't meant to be crossed. There's no bad guy in Parasite like there is in a lot of other films, just opportunities. Kim Ki-woo saw an opportunity and ended up paying the price, and not deservedly so. I certainly don't sympathize with the rich family in the film, but at the same time I kinda don't sympathize with the poor family either. After all, they were exploitative, and that's clear enough to see. And the magic of the film is built through the fact that it doesn't demand you sympathize with either party in order to get something out of it. And the film makes itself easy to like, just in terms of how it's constructed on a technical level right from the very start. I love how low-level wide shots are used in order to communicate and convey certain features of the house, particularly a lot of reoccurring imagery about the stairs and this idea of rising up, which is particularly interesting when you consider the role that the underground plays in the narrative. And I also love how abrasive a lot of the editing is, cutting between the tragedy unfolding before the audience's very eyes and the people in the garden at the party who are completely unaware of it. After a point in the film, everything becomes about unsettling the audience, and I love the way that it's all executed. And wow, does it seriously work. But the stars of the show have to be those harrowing, over-the-shoulder shots, shot from a slightly lower angle than the audience might otherwise feel comfortable with, as to obscure the subject just enough to make the audience think that something might be wrong, but at that point in the narrative, the tragedy hasn't taken hold in the same way that it will do, and thus the audience are left with nothing but their own fears that something might go wrong at any second. which it does. And yeah, things do indeed go very wrong, and it's in particular that moment where the tone shifts that caught my attention. And it's genius the way in which that tonal transition is anchored through the mundane action of just a doorbell ringing. The fact that Bong Joon-ho can not only make that mundane action story-definingly dramatic, and how he uses it effectively as a hinge, as it's the moment where the tragedy of a story starts to really bleed through, that is certainly a testament to how amazing he is as a director. That was Bong Joon-ho's crowning moment in Parasite. And the fact that he pulled it off without the film feeling muddled or tonally inconsistent and incoherent is completely beyond me, and it's a complete wonder to behold. And after all that, if you're still not convinced of this film's quality, the ending of the film is the final gut punch that will convince you otherwise. The father effectively sentencing himself to exile in the house that he broke into, feeling both envy and resentment towards the people that he worked for. Ki Jung is killed, and Ki Woo can't help but look back on the events of that day with a feeling of bemusement. But even as he uncovers his father's ultimate fate, claiming that he has a plan that will end with his father having to do nothing but walk up the stairs, and even as those final events play out as Ki Woo envisions it, the subtext looms heavy and true over the film's final moments. Because after all, you know what plan never fails? No plan. No plan at all. You know why? Because life cannot be planned. Yeah, well, this film broke me and then some. But I do wish that the significance of the gift that Min gives to the family is explored in a little bit more detail. I would have liked that a little more. Because some of the symbolism is a little flimsy, especially in the way that the rock clings to the family. But that's one of only very few nitpicks in this otherwise perfect movie. This is a 9 out of 10. You've probably seen it. You probably love it even more than I do. But yeah, if you're still behind, go check it out if you have an opportunity, because it's amazing. It'll definitely go down as one of the best films of the year. Now, some films that will come out during the year will hit me on an emotional level. The one I've just discussed springs to mind. This is certainly not one of them. And yeah, I'm talking about DC's new film, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. This film could basically be best described as an hour and 50 minutes of amazing girl power awesomeness that I can't really imagine anyone disliking. It certainly does not demand a lot from its audience, but that might be its greatest strength as well. And make no mistake, this film is incredibly messy, but it's all the wilder for it, with Harley herself offering specific narration on events before going back in time to rectify to the audience how she got to that point. My rule with non-linear narratives is that they only work if it serves a greater thematic purpose. And here it unquestionably does, highlighting how much of a raging psycho Harley Quinn really is. And on the topic of Harley herself, Margot Robbie is more than up to the challenge of playing that role. If anything, her performance here only goes to show how miscast she was in Bombshell earlier this year. Her strengths clearly lie in the theatrical, and I hope to see her in more roles that allow her to channel that into her characters. And on the topic of the characters, the three who are called the Birds of Prey in this movie, I love every single one of them. I love how completely incompetent Renee Montoya is, to the extent that in that fight, in that climactic sequence when Harley and Renee Montoya are fighting against each other, she literally gets thrown out of a window by her. I love how much attitude and swagger Journey Smollett-Bell brings to Black Canary, even if the climax of her character arc is a little bit ridiculous, even for this movie. But by far my favourite character in the film is Huntress. Mary Elizabeth Winstead's understated charisma just brings her character to life for me. And her general awkwardness that she shows throughout the film was a hilarious subversion of what you might expect from her character. And I love the narrative as well. I love how each character has a uniquely defined arc that leads them to that climactic final battle at the end of all of it. And the fact that said battle is shot mostly in long takes and a lot of wide shots, that's all great. It's just shot in such a way that doesn't feel either forced or constructed, and it really works for me as a result. The film is most certainly one note in terms of its narrative, in the sense that that's really not the selling point of the movie. The selling point is more just how glamorous and wild and over the top the whole thing is. But that doesn't mean the film abandons narrative cohesion altogether. It really does come together very well. Yeah, despite the film being a complete and total mess. With the narrative being about Harley's selfish motivations in the wake of her breakup with Joker, as she tries to escape from the people who are trying to kill her, who end up completely around her. And needless to say, chaos ensues after that. But it's chaos with a point and creativity behind it. That's what makes this film for me. It's completely ridiculous. It's over the top, but it left me smiling super hard by the end of it. In other words, this is an 8 out of 10. That is probably the best thing a movie can do, make me smile. And yeah, it might not be one of the best movies of the year, but it's definitely one of the most immediate and fun. And yeah, I think that might be worth even more than just being a good movie at this point. So yeah, definitely check this out.